Hello, comrades. The next book that we're going to read is Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth. Just to give a little background on who Maurice Cornforth was. He was born on October 28th in 1909 and passed away December 31st in 1980. And he was a British Marxist philosopher. He studied at the University College in London as well as Trinity College in Cambridge and joined the Communist Party in Great Britain in 1931, it looks like. He's most well known for the book that we're about to read. It's actually the first volume in a 3-volume set. So volume 1 is Materialism and the Dialectical Method. Volume 2 is entitled Historical Materialism, and then volume 3 is The Theory of Knowledge. Now, I'm only going to cover this first one, as it is a very fantastic, honestly, introduction into dialectical materialism, which is the main philosophy, and really it's a philosophy, but it's also a science, and we'll get into that as we read through Maurice Cornforth's book, and how this is the establishment, this is the foundation of Marxism, in that it's a scientific method where we look at everything in a scientific fashion, finding the actual reasons for why things happen, utilizing a materialist mindset, which is according to the rules of the universe, in a sense. So we'll get started there. I'll probably read the first 3 chapters, and then over the next couple of weeks, I'll read through the entire book for your benefit. And if you don't know what dialectical materialism is, I highly encourage you to listen to me read this book or go out there and find it yourself. It's available for free to download on Marxist.org under Maurice Cornforth's bibliography. That's where I got this copy, but of course you're welcome to listen along or read along. I will display the text as I am reading it as well, just like I did with the Communist Manifesto. This one might actually be easier because I don't actually have a physical copy of it, so I will be screen recording as I read it. With that, if you're unfamiliar with Marxism, if you're unfamiliar with socialism, communism, you want to start here. Communist Manifesto, of course, great place to start. That gives you kind of your foot into the door. You want to understand how Marxist thinkers get their philosophy, get their ideas. It is established and foundationalized in this mode of thought, which is dialectical materialism. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth. And the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth. Author's note on the 4th edition. This little book on materialism and the dialectical method originated from lectures given under the auspices of the London District Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1950. That was a long time ago, and a lot has been thought and written on the subject since then. I'm glad that nevertheless it has continued to be found useful, though to try and make it so I have now had to revise it 3 times over. In these revisions, I have changed as little as possible. In preparing this 4th edition, I've made mostly only minor stylistic changes intended to render the meaning clearer and avoid misunderstandings. In particular, I have left intact references to J.V. Stalin's booklet on dialectical and historical materialism and Mao Zedong's lecture on contradictions, both of which seem to me to remain worthy of quotation whatever may be objected against others' words and deeds of their authors. The only substantial change I have made is in the reference to biology and the controversial theories of Trofim Lysenko in Chapter 7, where what I had written originally was obviously written in error. I would like to stress that this book has no pretensions to be anything more than an introduction. It is not a textbook of Marxist philosophy, but an introduction to some key philosophical ideas of Marxism, which it still remains for Marxists to work out, criticize, and develop further. MC. London, January 1968. Part 1. Materialism. Chapter 1. Party Philosophy. Party Philosophy and Class Philosophy. A revolutionary working-class party needs a revolutionary working-class philosophy, and that philosophy is dialectical materialism. This assertion may appear a strange one, both to many politicians and to many philosophers. But we will not begin to understand dialectical materialism unless we can grasp the thought which lies behind it. Let us ask, first of all, what conception of philosophy lies behind the assertion that a political party, or, since a party is always the political representative of a class, A class needs to work out and adopt a definite philosophy of its own. By philosophy is usually meant our most general account in the nature of the world and of mankind's place and destiny in it, our world outlook. That being understood, it is evident that everybody has some kind of philosophy, even though he has never learned to discuss it. Everybody is influenced by philosophical views, even though he has not thought them out for himself and cannot formulate them. Some people, for example, think that this world is nothing but a vale of tears, and that our life in it is the preparation for a better life in another world and better world. They accordingly believe that we should suffer whatever befalls us with fortitude, not struggling against it, but trying to do whatever good we can to our fellow creatures. This is one kind of philosophy, one kind of world outlook. Other people think that the world is a place to grow rich in, and that each should look out for himself. This is another kind of philosophy. But granted that our philosophy is our world outlook, the task arises of working out this world outlook systematically and in detail, turning it into a well-formulated and coherent theory, turning vaguely held popular beliefs and attitudes into more or less systematic doctrines. This is what the philosophers do. By the time the philosophers have worked out their theories, they have often produced something very complicated, very abstract, and very hard to understand. But even though only comparatively few people may read and digest the actual productions of philosophers, these productions may and do have a very wide influence. For the fact that philosophers have systematized certain beliefs reinforces those beliefs and helps to impose them upon wide masses of ordinary people. Hence, everyone is influenced in one way or another by philosophers, even though they have never read the works of those philosophers. And if this is the case, we cannot regard the systems of the philosophers as being wholly products of the brainwork of the individual philosophers. Of course, the formulation of views, the peculiar ways in which they are worked out and written down, is the work of the particular philosopher. But the views themselves, in their most general aspect, have a social basis in ideas which reflect the social activities and social relations of the time, and which, therefore, do not spring ready-made out of the heads of philosophers. From this we may proceed a step further. When society is divided into classes, and society always has been divided into classes ever since the dissolution of the primitive communes, that is to say, throughout the entire historical period to which the history of philosophy belongs, then the various views which are current in society always express the outlooks of various classes. We may conclude, therefore, that the various systems of the philosophers also always express a class outlook. They are, in fact, nothing but the systemic working out and theoretical formulation of a class outlook, or, if you prefer, the ideology of a definite classes. Philosophy is and always has been class philosophy. Philosophers may not realize this, but that does not alter the fact. For people do not and cannot think in isolation from society, and therefore from class interests and class struggles, which pervade society any more than they can live and act in such isolation. A philosophy is a world outlook, an attempt to understand the world, mankind, and man's place in the world. Such an outlook cannot be anything but the outlook of a class, and the philosopher functions as the thinking representative of a class. How can it be otherwise? Philosophies are not imported from some other planet, but are produced here on Earth by people involved, whether they like it or not, in existing class relations and class struggles. Therefore, whatever philosophers say about themselves, there is no philosophy which does not embody a class outlook, or which is impartial as opposed to partisan in relation to class struggles. Search as we may, we shall not find any impartial, non-partisan, non-class philosophy. Bearing this in mind, then, we shall find that the philosophies of the past have all, in one way or another, expressed the outlook of so-called educated classes, that is to say, of the exploiting classes. In general, it is the leaders of society who express and propagate their ideas in the form of systematic philosophies, and up to the appearance of the modern working class, which is the peculiar product of capitalism, these leaders have always been the exploiting classes. It is their outlook which has dominated philosophy, just as they have dominated society. We can only conclude from this that the working class, if today it intends to take over leadership of society, needs to express its own class outlook in philosophical form, and to oppose this philosophy to the philosophies which express the outlook and defend the interests of the exploiters. The services rendered by Marx and Engels to the working class may be expressed in a few words thus. They taught the working class to know itself and be conscious of itself, and they substituted science for dreams, wrote Lenin in his obituary on Frederick Engels. Marx and Engels founded and established the revolutionary theory of working class struggle, which illumines the road by which the working class can throw off capitalist exploitation, can take the leadership of all the masses of the people, and so free the whole of society once and for all oppression and exploitation of man by man. They taught that without its own party, independent of all bourgeois parties, the working class certainly could not win victory over capitalism, could not lead the whole of society forward to the abolition of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. Lenin further developed the Marxist teachings about the party. He showed that the party must act as the vanguard of its class, the most conscious section of its class, and that it is the instrument for winning and wielding political power. To fill such a role, the party must evidently have knowledge, understanding, and vision. In other words, it must be equipped with revolutionary theory, on which its policies are based and by which its activities are guided. This theory is the theory of Marxism, and it is not just an economic theory, nor yet exclusively a political theory, but a world outlook, a philosophy. Economic and political views are not and never can be independent of a general world outlook. Specific economic and political views express the world outlook of those who hold such views, and conversely, philosophical views find expression in views on economics and politics. Recognizing all this, a revolutionary party of the working class cannot but formulate, and having formulated, hold fast to, develop, and treasure its party philosophy. In this philosophy, dialectical materialism, are embodied the general ideas by means of which the party understands the world which it is seeking to change and in terms of which it defines its aims and works out how to fight for them. In this philosophy are embodied the general ideas by means of which the party seeks to enlighten and organize the whole class, and to influence, guide, and win over all the masses of working people, showing the conclusions which must be drawn from each stage of the struggle, helping people to learn from their own experience how to go forward towards socialism. And so we see why it is that in our times a philosophy has arisen which expresses the revolutionary world outlook of the working class. Experience itself has taught the party the need for philosophy. For experience shows that if we do not have our own revolutionary socialist philosophy, then inevitably we borrow our ideas from hostile, anti-socialist sources. If we do not adopt today the outlook of the working class and of the struggle for socialism, then we adopt or slip into, without meaning to do so, that of the capitalists and of the struggle against socialism. This is why the working class party, if it is to be the genuine revolutionary leadership of its class, and is not to be misled its class by the importation of hostile capitalist ideas, and of policies corresponding to such ideas, must be concerned to formulate, defend, and propagate its own revolutionary philosophy. Class philosophy in truth. Against what has just been said about a class and party philosophy, the objection is bound to be raised that such a conception is a complete travesty of the whole idea of philosophy. Class interests may incline us to believe one thing rather than another, some will say, but should not philosophy be above this? Should not philosophy be objective and impartial and teach us to set class and party interests aside and to seek only for the truth? For surely what is true, whether this suits some or other class interests or not. If philosophy is partisan, party philosophy, how can it be objective? How can it be true philosophy? In reply to such objections, we may say that the working class standpoint in philosophy is very far indeed from having no concern for truth. Is there no such thing as truth? Of course there is, and men are getting nearer to it. For different outlooks, partisan as they may be, are not on a level so far as nearness to truth is concerned. Every philosophy embodies a class outlook. Yes, just as one class differs from another class in its social role and in its contribution to the development of society, so one philosophy embodies positive achievements in comparison with another in the working out of the truth about the world and society. People are prone to believe that if we adopt a partisan class standpoint, then we turn our backs on truth, and that, on the other hand, If we genuinely seek for truth, then we must be strictly impartial and nonpartisan. But the contrary is the case. It is only when we adopt the partisan standpoint of historically the most progressive class that we are able to get nearer to the truth. The definition of dialectical materialism, therefore, as the philosophy of the Revolutionary Working Class Party, is in no way incompatible with the claim of dialectical materialism to express truth, and to be a means of arriving at truth. On the contrary, we have every right to make this claim in view of the actual historical position and role of the working class. Except for the working class, all other classes which have aspired to take the leadership of society have been exploiting classes. But every exploiting class, whether its achievements, has always to find some way of disguising its real position and aims, both from itself and from the exploited, and of making out that its rule is just and permanent. For such a class can never recognize its real position and aims as an exploiting class, or the temporary character of its own system. For example, in ancient slave society, Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of antiquity, made out that the institution of slavery was decreed by nature, since some men were by nature slaves. In the heyday of feudal society, the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, represented the entire universe as being a kind of feudal system. Everything was arranged in a feudal hierarchy, with God surrounded by the chief archangels at the top. Everything depended on what was next above it in the system, and nothing could exist without God. As for capitalism, it dissolves all feudal ties and, as Marx and Engels observed in the Communist Manifesto, has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. This was reflected in the beginnings of capitalist philosophy, especially in Britain. This philosophy saw the world as consisting of independent atoms, each complete in itself, concerned only with itself, and all interacting. This was a mirror of capitalist society, as seen by the rising bourgeoisie, and by means of such ideas they succeeded, too, in disguising their own aims of domination and profit. Worker and capitalist were on a level. Each was a free human atom, and they entered into a free contract, and the one to work, the other to provide capital and pay wages. But the working class does not need any such false consciousness as is contained in such philosophies. It does not want to set up a new system of exploitation, but to abolish all exploitation of man by man. For this reason, it has no interest whatever in disguising anything, but rather in understanding things just as they really are. For the better it understands the truth, the more it is strengthened in its struggle. Moreover, other classes have always wanted to perpetuate themselves and to last out for as long as they could, and so they have favored philosophical systems which give themselves a permanent place in the universe. Such systems attempt to define the nature of the universe so as to represent certain things and certain relations as being necessary, eternal, and unchangeable. And then they make it appear that a particular social system is necessary part of the whole. But the working class does not need to perpetuate itself. On the contrary, it needs to do away with its own existence as a class as quickly as possible, and to establish a classless society. Therefore, the working class has no use at all for any philosophical system which establishes any false permanence. Its class position and aims are such that it can afford to and needs to recognize and trace out the change, coming into being and ceasing to be of everything in existence. Our party philosophy, then, has a right to lay claim to truth, for it is the only philosophy which is based on a standpoint which demands that we should always seek to understand things just as they are, in all their manifold changes and interconnections, without disguises and without fantasy. A revolution in philosophy. The Marxian doctrine is omnipotent because it is true, wrote Lenin. It is complete and harmonious and provides men with an integral world conception which is irreconcilable with any form of superstition, reaction, or defense of bourgeois oppression. And that is from the three sources and three component parts of Marxism. He further wrote, there is nothing resembling sectarianism in Marxism, in the sense of it being hidebound, petrified doctrine, a doctrine which arose away from the high road of development of world civilization. On the contrary, the genius of Marx consists precisely in the fact that he furnished answers to questions the foremost minds of mankind had already raised. His teachings arose as the direct and immediate continuation of the teachings of the greatest representatives of philosophy, political economy, and socialism. In its philosophical aspect, Marxism appears as the culmination of a whole great development of philosophical thought, in which the problems of philosophy were posed and took shape in the course of a series of revolutions. This, its highest point being reached in the classical German philosophy of the early 19th century. But if Marxism is thus the continuation and culmination of the past achievements of philosophy, it is a continuation which puts an end to an epoch and constitutes a new point of departure. For in comparison with past philosophies, it launches out on new lines. It constitutes a revolution in philosophy, an end to the systems of the past, a philosophy of an entirely new kind. Marxism is no longer a philosophy which expresses the world outlook of an exploiting class, of a minority, striving to impose its rule and its ideas upon the masses of the people, in order to keep them in subjection. But it is a philosophy which serves the common people in their struggle to throw off all exploitation and to build a classless society. Marxism is a philosophy which seeks to understand the world in order to change it. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, wrote Marx. The point, however, is to change it. Therefore, if we could say of past philosophy that it has been an attempt to understand the world and man's place and destiny in it, an attempt necessarily conditioned by the class outlook, prejudices, and illusions of the various exploiting class philosophers, we have to say of Marxist philosophy that it is an attempt to understand the world in order to change the world and to shape and realize man's destiny in it. Dialectical materialism is a theoretical instrument in the hands of the people for use in changing the world. Marxism, therefore, seeks to base our ideas of things on nothing but the actual investigation of them, arising from and tested by experience and practice. It does not invent a system as previous philosophies have done, and then try to make everything fit into it. Thus, dialectical materialism is in the truest sense a popular philosophy, a scientific philosophy, and a philosophy of practice. The revolutionary characteristics of dialectical materialism are embodied in the two features of Marxist philosophy which give it its name: dialectics and materialism. In order to understand things so as to change them, we must study them, not according to the dictates of any abstract system, but in their real changes and interconnections. And that is what is meant by dialectics. We must set aside preconceived ideas and fancies about things and strive to make our theories correspond to the real conditions of material existence. And that means that our outlook in theory is materialistic. In Dialectical Materialism, wrote Engels in his book Ludwig Feuerbach, the materialist world outlook was taken really seriously for the first time, and was carried through consistently. For it was resolved to comprehend the real world, nature and history, just as it presents itself to everyone who approaches it free from preconceived idealist fancies. It was decided relentlessly to sacrifice every idealist fancy which could not be brought into harmony with the facts conceived in their own and not in a fantastic connection. And materialism means nothing more than this. Chapter 2. Materialism and Idealism. Materialism and idealism, opposed ways of interpreting every question. Materialism is not a dogmatic system. It is rather a way of interpreting, conceiving of, explaining every question. The materialist way of interpreting events, of conceiving of things and their interconnections, is opposed to the idealist way of interpreting and conceiving of them. Materialism is opposed to idealism. On every question, there are materialist and idealist ways of interpreting it, materialist and idealist ways of trying to understand it. Thus, materialism and idealism are not two opposed abstract theories about the nature of the world, of small concern to ordinary practical folk. They are opposed ways of interpreting and understanding every question, and, consequently, they express opposite approaches in practice and lead to very different conclusions in terms of practical activity. Nor are they, as some use the terms, opposite moral attitudes, the one high-minded, the other base and self-seeking. If we use the terms like this, we will never understand the opposition between idealist and materialist conceptions. For this way of speaking is, as Engels said, nothing but an unpardonable concession to the traditional Philistine prejudice against the word materialism, resulting from long-continued defamation by priests. But the word materialism, the Philistine understands gluttony, drunkenness, lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, arrogance, cupidity, miserliness, profit hunting, and stock exchange swindling. In short, all the filthy vices in which he himself indulges in private. By the word idealism, he understands the belief in virtue, universal philanthropy, and in a general way, a better world, of which he boasts before others. And that is from Ludwig Feuerbach. Before trying to define materialism and idealism in general terms, let us consider how these two ways of understanding things are expressed in relation to certain simple and familiar questions. This will help us to grasp the significance of the distinction between a materialist and an idealist interpretation. First, let us consider a very familiar natural phenomenon, a thunderstorm. What causes thunderstorms? An idealist way of answering this question is to say that thunderstorms are due to the anger of God. Being angry, he arranges for lightning and thunderbolts to descend upon mankind. The materialist way of understanding thunderstorms is opposed to this. The materialist would try to explain and understand thunderstorms as being solely due to what we call natural forces. For example, ancient materialists suggested that far from thunderstorms being due to the anger of the gods, they are caused by material particles in the clouds banging against one another. That this particular explanation was wrong is not the point. The point is that it was an attempt at materialist, as opposed to idealist, explanation. Nowadays, a great deal more is known about thunderstorms arising from the scientific investigation of the natural forces involved. Knowledge remains very incomplete, but at all events enough is known to make it quite clear that the explanation must be on materialist lines, so that the idealist explanation has become thoroughly discredited. It will be seen that while the idealist explanation tries to relate the phenomenon to be explained to some spiritual cause, in this case the anger of God, the materialist explanation relates it to material causes. In this example, most educated people today would agree in accepting the materialist interpretation. This is because they generally accept the scientific explanation of natural phenomenon, and every advance of natural science is an advance in the materialist understanding of nature. Let us take a second example, this time one arising out of social life. For instance, why are there rich and poor? This is a question which many people ask, especially poor people. The most straightforward idealist answer to this question is to say simply, it is because God made them so. It is the will of God that some should be rich and others poor. But others less straightforward idealist explanations are more in vogue. For example, it is because some men are careful and farsighted, and these husband their resources and grow rich, while others are thriftless and stupid, and these remain poor. Those who favor this type of explanation say that it is all due to eternal human nature. The nature of man and of society is such that the distinction of rich and poor necessarily arises. Just as in the case of the thunderstorm, so in the case of the rich and poor, the idealist seeks for some spiritual cause. If not in the will of God, the divine mind, then in certain innate characteristics of the human mind. The materialist, on the other hand, seeks the reason in the material, economic conditions of social life. If society is divided into rich and poor, it is because the production of the material means of life is so ordered that some have possession of the land and other means of production, while the rest have to work for them. However hard they may work and however much they may scrape and save, the non-possessors will remain poor, while the possessors grow rich on the fruits of their labor. On such questions, therefore, the difference between a materialist and an idealist conception can be very important. And the difference is important not merely in a theoretical, but in a practical sense. A materialist conception of thunderstorms, for example, helps us to take precautions against them, such as fitting buildings with lightning conductors. But if our explanation of thunderstorms is idealist, all we can do is watch and pray. If we accept an idealist account of the existence of rich and poor, all we can do is accept the existing state of affairs, rejoicing in our superior status and bestowing a little charity if we are rich, and cursing our fate if we are poor. But armed with the materialist understanding of society, we can begin to see the way to change society. It is clear, therefore, that while some may have a vested interest in idealism, it is in the interest of the great majority to learn to think and to understand things in the materialist way. How, then, can we define materialism and idealism and the difference between them in general terms, so as to define the essence of the question? This was done by Engels in the book on Ludwig Feuerbach. The great basic question of all philosophy, especially of modern philosophy, is that concerning the relation of thinking and being. The answers which the philosophers have given to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primacy of spirit to nature, and therefore in the last instance assumed world creation in some form or another, comprised the camp idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belonged to the various schools of materialism. Idealism is the way of interpreting things Idealism is the way of interpreting things which regards the spiritual as prior to the material, whereas materialism regards the material as prior. Idealism supposes that everything material is dependent on and determined by something spiritual, whereas materialism recognizes that everything spiritual is dependent on and determined by something material. And this difference manifests itself both in general philosophical conceptions of the world as a whole and in conceptions of particular things and events. Idealism and the supernatural. At bottom, idealism is religion, theology. Idealism is clericalism, wrote Lenin in his philosophical notebooks. All idealism is a continuation of the religious approach to questions, even though particular idealist theories have shed their religious skin. Idealism is inseparable from superstition, belief in the supernatural, the mysterious, and unknowable. Materialism, on the other hand, seeks for explanations in terms belonging to the material world, in terms of factors which we can verify, understand, and control. The roots of the idealist conception of things are, then, the same as those of religion. To believers, the conceptions of religion, that is to say, conceptions of supernatural spiritual beings, generally seem to have their justification, not, of course, in any evidence of the senses, but in something which lies deep within the spiritual nature of man. And indeed, it is true that these conceptions do have very deep roots in the historical development of human consciousness. But what is their origin? How did such conceptions arise in the first place? We can certainly not regard such conceptions as being the products, as religion itself tells us, of divine revelation, or as arising from any other supernatural cause, if we find that they themselves have a natural origin. And such an origin can in fact be traced. Conceptions of the supernatural and religious ideas in general owe their origin first of all to the helplessness and ignorance of men in face of the forces of nature. Forces which men cannot understand are personified. They are represented as manifestations of the activity of spirits. For example, such alarming events as thunderstorms were, as we have seen, explained fantastically as due to the anger of gods. Again, such important phenomena as the growth of crops were put down to the activity of a spirit. It was believed that it was the corn spirit that made the corn grow. From the most primitive times, men personified natural forces in this way. With the birth of class society, when men were impelled to act by social relations which dominated them and which they did not understand, they further invented supernatural agencies doubling, as it were, the state of society. The gods were invented superior to mankind, just as the kings and lords were superior to the common people. All religion and all idealism has at its heart this kind of doubling of the world. It is dualistic and invents a dominating ideal or supernatural world order against the real material world. Very characteristic of idealism are such antitheses as soul and body, God and man, the heavenly kingdom and the earthly kingdom, the forms and ideas of things grasped by the intellect, and the world of material reality perceptible by the senses. For idealism, there is always a higher, more real, non-material world, which is prior to the material world, is its ultimate source and cause, and to which the material world is subject. For materialism, on the other hand, there is one world, the material world. By idealism and philosophy, we mean any doctrine which says that beyond material reality, there is a higher spiritual reality, in terms of which the material reality is in the last analysis to be explained. Some varieties of present-day idealist philosophy. At this point, a few observations may be useful concerning some characteristic doctrines of modern bourgeois philosophy. For nearly 300 years, there has been put forward a variety of philosophy known as subjective idealism. This teaches that the material world does not exist at all. Nothing exists but the sensations and ideas in our minds, and there is no external material reality corresponding to them. And then again, this subjective idealism is put forward in the form of a doctrine concerning knowledge. It denies that we can know anything about objective reality outside ourselves, and says that we can have knowledge of appearances only and not of things in themselves. This sort of idealism has become very fashionable today. It even parades as extremely scientific. When capitalism was still a progressive force, bourgeois thinkers used to believe that we could know more and more about the real world and so control natural forces and improve the lot of mankind indefinitely. Now they are saying that the real world is unknowable, the arena of mysterious forces which pass our comprehension. We have seen that, at bottom, idealism always believes in two worlds, the ideal and the material, and it places the ideal prior to and above the material. Materialism, on the other hand, knows one world only, the material world, and refuses to invent a second imaginary superior ideal world. Materialism and idealism are irreconcilably opposed. But this does not stop many philosophers from trying to reconcile and combine them. In philosophy, there are also various attempted compromises between idealism and materialism. One such attempted compromise is often known as dualism. Such a compromise philosophy asserts the existence of the spiritual as separate and distinct from the material, but it tries to place the two on a level. Thus, it treats the world of non-living matter in a thoroughly materialistic way. This, it says, is the sphere of activity of natural forces, and spiritual factors do not enter into it and have nothing to do with it in any way. But when it comes to mind and society, here, says this philosophy, is the sphere of activity of spirit. Here, it maintains, we must seek explanations in idealist and not in materialist terms. Such a compromise between materialism and idealism therefore amounts to this, that with regard to all the most important questions concerning men, society, and history, we are to continue to adopt idealist conceptions and to oppose materialism. Another compromise philosophy is known as realism. In its modern form, this philosophy has arisen in opposition to subjective idealism. The realist philosophers say that the external material world really exists independent of our perceptions and is in some way reflected by our perceptions. In this, the realists agree with the materialists in opposition to subjective idealism. Indeed, you cannot be a materialist unless you are a thoroughgoing realist on the question of the real existence of the material world. But merely to assert that the external world exists independent of our perceiving it is not to be a materialist. For example, the great Catholic philosopher of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, was in this sense a realist, and to this day most Catholic theologians regard it as a heresy to be anything but a realist in philosophy. But at the same time, they assert that the material world, which really exists, was created by God, and is sustained and ruled all the time by the power of God, by a spiritual power. So far from being materialists, they are idealists. Moreover, the word realism is much abused by philosophers. So long as you believe that something or other is real, you may call yourself a realist. Some philosophers think that not only is the world of material things real, but that there is also, outside space and time, a real world of universals, of the abstract essences of things. So these call themselves realists. Others say that, although nothing exists but the perceptions in our minds, nevertheless these perceptions are real. So these call themselves realists too. All of which goes to show that some philosophers are very tricky in their use of words. The basic teachings of materialism in opposition to idealism. In opposition to all the forms of idealism and of tricky compromises between materialism and idealism, the basic teachings of materialism can be formulated very simply and clearly. To grasp the essence of these teachings, we should also understand what are the main assertions made in every form of idealism. There are three such main assertions of idealism. 1. Idealism asserts that the material world is dependent on the spiritual. 2. Idealism asserts that spirit or mind or idea can and does exist in separation from matter. The most extreme form of this assertion is subjective idealism, which asserts that matter does not exist at all but is pure illusion. 3. Idealism asserts that there exists a realm of the mysterious and unknowable, above, or beyond, or behind, what can be ascertained and known by perception, experience, and science. The basic teachings of materialism stand in opposition to these three assertions of idealism. 1. Materialism teaches that the world is by its very nature material, that everything which exists comes into being on the basis of material causes, arises and develops in accordance with the laws of motion of matter. 2. Materialism teaches that matter is objective reality existing outside and independent of the mind, and that far from the mental existing in separation from the material, everything mental or spiritual is a product of material processes. 3. Materialism teaches that the world and its laws are knowable, and that while much in the material world may not be known, there is no unknowable sphere of reality which lies outside the material world. The Marxist philosophy is characterized by its absolutely consistent materialism all along the line, by its making no concessions whatever at any point to idealism. Materialism and idealism in practice. As was pointed out above, the opposition of materialism and idealism, which has now been stated in its most general terms, is not an opposition between abstract theories of the nature of the world, but is an opposition between different ways of understanding and interpreting every question. That is why it is of such profound importance. Let us consider some of the very practical ways in which the opposition of materialism and idealism is manifested. Idealists tell us, for example, not to place too much reliance on science. They tell us that the most important truths are beyond the reach of science. Hence, they encourage us not to believe things on the basis of evidence, experience, practice, but to take them on trust from those who pretend to know best and to have some higher source of information. In this way, idealism is a very good friend and standby of every form of reactionary propaganda. It is the philosophy of the capitalist press and the BBC. It favors superstitions of all sorts, prevents us from thinking for ourselves, and making a scientific approach to moral and social problems. Again, idealists tell us that what is most important for us all is the inner life of the soul. They tell us that we shall never solve our human problems except by some inner regeneration. This is a favorite theme in the speeches of well-fed persons, but many workers fall for it too. In factories, for example, where a moral rearmament group is active. They tell you not to fight for better conditions, but to improve your soul. They do not tell you that the best way to improve yourself, both materially and morally, is to join in the fight for peace and socialism. Again, an idealist approach is common amongst many socialists. Many sincere socialists, for example, think that what is essentially wrong with capitalism is that goods are unfairly distributed, and that if only we could get everyone, including the capitalists, to accept a new conception of fairness and justice, then we could do away with the evils of capitalism. Socialism, to them, is nothing but the realization of an abstract idea of justice. The idealism of this belief lies in its assumption that it is simply the ideas which we hold that determine the way we live and the way society is organized. Those who think in this way forget to look for the material causes, for what in fact determines the way goods are distributed in capitalist society. The wealth enjoyed by one part of society while the other and greater part lives in poverty is not the ideas which men hold about the distribution of wealth, but the material fact that the mode of production rests on the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist. So long as this mode of production remains in existence, so long will extremes of wealth and poverty remain, and so long will socialist ideas of justice be opposed by capitalist ideas of justice. The task of socialists, therefore, is to organize and lead the struggle of the working class against the capitalist class to the point where the working class takes power from the capitalist class. If we do not understand this, then we cannot find the way to fight effectively for socialism. We shall find that our socialist ideas are constantly disappointed and betrayed. Such indeed has been the experience of British socialism. It can be seen from these examples how idealism serves as a weapon of reaction, and how, when socialists embrace idealism, they are being influenced by the ideology of the capitalists. We can no more take over and use capitalist ideas for the purpose of socialist theory than we can take over and use the capitalist state machine. with all its institutions and officials for the purposes of building socialism. Right through history, indeed, idealism has been a weapon of reaction. Whatever fine systems of philosophy have been invented, idealism has been used as a means of justifying the rule of an exploiting class and deceiving the exploited. This is not to say that truths have not been expressed in an idealist guise. Of course they have, for idealism has very deep roots in our ways of thinking, and so men often clothe their thoughts and aspirations in idealist dress. But the idealist form is always an impediment, a hindrance in the expression of truth, a source of confusion and error. Again, progressive movements in the past have adopted and fought under an idealist ideology. But this has shown only that they contained in themselves the seeds of future reaction, inasmuch as they represented the striving of a new exploiting class to come to power, or that they were themselves influenced by ideas of reaction, or it has been a mark of their weakness and immaturity. For example, the great revolutionary movement of the English bourgeoisie in the 17th century fought under idealist religious slogans. But the same appeal to God which justified Cromwell in the execution of the king justified him also in stamping out the levelers. Early Democrats and socialists had many idealist notions, but in their case this demonstrated the immaturity and weakness of the movement. The idealist illusions had to be overcome if the revolutionary working class movement was to arise in triumph. As the movement grew strong, the continuance within it of idealist notions represented an alien reactionary influence. We can truly say that idealism is essentially a conservative force, an ideology helping the defense of things as they are, and the preservation of illusions in men's minds about their true condition. On the other hand, every real social advance, every increase in the productive forces, every advance of science generates materialism and is helped along by materialist ideas. And the whole history of human thought has been the history of the fight of materialism against idealism, of the overcoming of idealist illusions and fantasies. Materialism teaches us to have confidence in ourselves, in the working class, in people. It teaches us that there are no mysteries beyond our understanding, that we need not accept that which is as being the will of God, that we should contemptuously reject the authoritative teachings of those who set up to be our masters, and that we can ourselves understand nature and society so as to be able to change them. So that is the first two chapters of Materialism and the Dialectical Method. Sorry. Just to kind of simplify it, that can be a lot all at once. Hopefully you understood it. A way that it was simplified for me that I really liked was the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. If you say yes, congratulations, you are a materialist. The tree making a sound falling in the forest does not rely on a human being there to perceive it falling and making that sound. It's going to happen regardless because that is how physics work. So that's materialism. To add dialectical to it, you would go through all the changes, all the functions of why did that tree fall in the forest in the first place? Was the ground eroding away? Was there heavy rainfalls that was causing the underbrush, the fauna, the flora to loosen up the dirt so that the tree fell? Was it a logger? Something along those lines. So materialism, does the tree fall in the forest make a sound? Yes, obviously it does. That's, we live in a planet with atmosphere on it. There's a part of dialecticalism right there. Coming up with the interconnectedness, the reasons why materialist things happen. So hope you enjoyed this. I will have chapters 3 and 4. I'm shooting for another one sometime this week. It is very hectic and busy for me right now with work and school going on. But I'm going to try and post on this at least once a week to continue on the books that we'll be reading. So we'll go over this book here. And if you have any suggestions for what you want to hear, please put them in the comments. I have some ideas, but I didn't really plan on reading this book until I saw it on a post on RedNote. And I'm like, that looks interesting, and immediately liked it. Realized that this is what we need to first start with to establish an understanding of dialectical materialism before we can get into other Marxist thought, Marxist ideals. So thank you. Have a good day.